Hi everyone, I'm Josh O'Connell, and this is episode 5 of Irish Tax Unwrapped. Whether you're a business owner, an investor, or just curious, we break down Ireland's tax code for everyone. To start, I'd like to thank listeners for messaging us about the show. It's great to know that people are interested and enjoying the content. We had a few emails asking if we'd explain the Apple tax case, which is something we might cover in a future episode. This brings me to some of the stories we were chatting about off-air. Derek and Daphne of Coventure Tax Consulting are here to discuss the tax topics of the day. Hi guys.
Hi Josh, great to be back again.
Hey Josh, nice to be back.
Daphne, can I ask, what's caught your eye in recent weeks?
Josh, where do I start? Closer to home, you have the recent Irish election. All eyes will be focused on what implications will be for tax policy from the new government. Across the pond, you have Trump 2.0. Is Ireland in Trump's crosshairs?
Crosshairs, how?
Josh, when the Wall Street Journal is running headlines like the Irish government is unbelievably rich, it's largely thanks to Uncle Sam, you know that's putting a target on our back.
Anything else?
The story that really caught my eye is the story about Mayo GAA.
Oh yeah.
They're under a revenue audit and they've made a voluntary disclosure to the tune of 119,000, and they've made it publicly known, which is unheard of.
So Derek, what's caught your eye?
Daphne already alluded to the surge in corporate tax revenues, due in no small part to the Apple money. Some of this will be used to fulfil election promises, and it'll be interesting to see what is the government policy about spending the rest.
They'll pay an extra €500 to people renting and finally fix housing.
Just published is the latest tax defaulters list, and that makes interesting reading, especially as there were a number of accountants on it. Also named as a defaulter is Ivor Carlow, the former TD for Dublin North Central. I can never understand how people end up being published when it's quite easy to avoid if you know how.
So, is that it?
2024 was a testing ground for a new reporting system for non-taxable cash payments. Things like the small benefit exemption, remote daily allowances, mileage, the list goes on.
I think record keeping in this area has always been a little, shall we say, lax.
That's fair. In reality, the problem for many is not getting familiar with the new system, it's getting familiar with a new culture of record keeping and reporting. Revenue gave a grace period of up to June, then the end of the year, for employers to make changes. But from next year, the gloves are off. Employers must report non-taxable payments in real time, and those that don't are going to face heavy penalties.
Daphne, the GAA audit story is intriguing. There seems to be more going on than meets the eye.
There's a lot to unpack in this case. Seamus Toohey of Mayo GAA, he recently made it known that the Mayo County Board is in the middle of a revenue audit. What's really unusual here is to know that there's already 120 grand on the table.
What's the game plan with announcing this, when the audit must have a long way to go?
Strikes me as a political strategy. Of course, they don't want to be isolated, so they're reaching out to the top brass of GAA headquarters.
I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship between the revenue and the GAA. Derek, politics aside, what do you think of the case? What advice would you have for Mayo GAA or any other county for that matter?
If I could only give 2 tips, the first would be not to go on a solo run. Build a strong team and make sure the corner forward is a tax expert with experience of revenue audits. The second tip would be to never let your guard down.
You just switched codes to boxing.
That's because I have an interesting boxing story to share with you, Josh. It's about a guy called Victor Ortiz, who was born in Kansas. He grew up to be a boxer and was involved in a fight that had one of the most shocking endings in boxing history. And believe it or not, his story is a valuable lesson for anyone involved in a revenue audit.
Well, take it away, Derek. We're listening.
Ortiz was a real rags to riches boxer. Abandoned by his parents at a young age, he'd had a tough upbringing and he found an outlet in the ring. He rose through the ranks to become the WBC welterweight champion of the world in 2010 after an absolutely explosive victory over Andre Berto. At just 24 years old, he was in his prime and he agrees to fight Floyd Mayweather.
Floyd Mayweather. Now, this guy I've heard of.
Mayweather is a household name in boxing, a legend of the sport, and widely regarded as the best defensive boxer of his era. He's 34 going on 35. His record is undefeated after 41 fights, but he's been out of the ring for almost a year and a half.
So the younger guy is fighting an older established boxer who's been on a hiatus from boxing.
Yeah, so the fight was in September 2011 at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas. The bout started with Mayweather demonstrating his signature defensive style and sharp counterpunching. Ortiz, well, he's struggling to land clean shots against Mayweather's elusive defense. After the first 3 rounds, Mayweather is clearly outboxing Ortiz, and he's leading on all the judges' scorecards. We're in the 4th round, and Ortiz is becoming more and more frustrated. But he's on the front foot. He's punching, trying to land shots, and he has Mayweather up against the ropes. With the referee, Joe Cortez, at close quarters, he jumps aggressively, leading with his head. He headbutts Mayweather in the mouth, cutting and stunning him. The referee appears to immediately pause the action. He pulls Ortiz back and then starts pointing to the judges in a motion that's telling them to deduct a point for the foul. Ortiz is apologising to Mayweather repeatedly, seems to try and hug him. The referee Cortez is distracted. Ortiz has his gloves down in what looks like a gesture of apology, and Mayweather strikes. He steps forward, delivers a quick left-right combination, and Ortiz is knocked out cold.
Wow. So, Ortiz dropped his guard for just a moment, and Mayweather capitalised to deliver a knockout punch.
In tax law, as in boxing, you can't afford to let your guard down. Back in Ireland, Josh, at almost the same time, a family business owner made an offhand comment during an audit that revenue used to land the decisive blow in his case.
So who were the key players in this bout?
The taxpayer was a seasoned construction entrepreneur who, along with his wife, had co-founded a successful building company in the 90s. Their son was next in line to take over the business, but the crux of the issue was a 2011 transaction being examined by Revenue, where the taxpayer had claimed retirement relief. Revenue challenged this, alleging it was a tax avoidance scheme.
Let's break that down. What exactly is retirement relief?
Retirement relief is a provision under tax law that allows a business owner to claim exemption from CGT when disposing of a qualifying business asset. Typically, it's employed as part of a retirement or succession plan.
I'm sure there are tons of conditions, but what's the key to accessing this relief?
The key for retirement relief is demonstrating a genuine transfer of control or a meaningful reduction in involvement with the business.
And that's where the taxpayer ran into trouble?
Yeah. While tax law doesn't demand literal retirement, like stopping work altogether, it does require evidence that the business owner is stepping back in a meaningful way. In this case, the taxpayer's actions didn't match his words.
What were Revenue's reasons for challenging his claim to retirement relief?
Revenue raised several red flags. The taxpayer and his wife retained significant control. They remained as directors of the company, and they continued to oversee financial and strategic decisions.
But in a family situation, I'm sure there's not always a clean break when passing on to a child. Were there any other problems that someone thinking of claiming retirement relief should know about?
A €700,000 payment for the taxpayer's exit was deferred for many years, which raised questions about the financial feasibility of the deal.
Okay. Other issues?
The taxpayer remained actively involved in the business. In fact, during the ensuing revenue audit, he played a key role, attending revenue meetings, handling discussions, and also negotiations.
I'm not sure I like the optics of that.
At one point during the revenue audit, during an exchange with Revenue, he made an offhand comment that nothing had really changed since the transaction.
Oh dear. That sounds like a costly slip of the tongue.
It was.
What was the significance of that comment?
The impact wasn't immediate, but later in the process, Revenue used this in their evidence that there had been no meaningful change in control, which undermined the taxpayer's case.
What was going on with the company during all this?
The background to this case is that while the company was solvent, it was financially stretched. The taxpayer wanted to transfer operational control to his son while ensuring the business survival, and this was achieved through restructuring the company in a series of transactions.
What did those transactions entail?
It's a little complicated. There were 3 steps. The taxpayer's son formed a holding company, and the taxpayer sold half of the shares in his company to the son's holding company. He then exchanged his remaining 50% for shares in the holding company, with the consequence that he indirectly retained 50% ownership.
That sounds unusual.
On paper, it looked like a succession plan, but Revenue argued that control hadn't genuinely changed hands.
So let me guess. The Revenue Commissioners and the taxpayer couldn't agree, and the matter was ruled on by the Tax Appeals Commission. How did that work out?
It was a bit of a car crash, to be honest. The taxpayer was asked about the statement he made at the audit meeting to the effect that nothing had changed in terms of his role. Rather than downplaying or questioning the comment, he confirmed having made it and just called it a mean quote. On top of that, he added context.
So we're not exactly playing three-dimensional chess here.
No, unfortunately, Josh, and at the appeal commissioners, his case quickly fell apart.
How so?
Revenue were able to produce evidence showing that the trading company had discharged his utility bills.
That's bad.
The company had issued checks for his parking fines, signed by him.
Double bad.
And he'd also signed checks for subcontractors after he'd supposedly stepped down.
I'm afraid to ask, how did the Tax Appeals Commission rule?
The Commission sided with Revenue. It acknowledged that retirement relief doesn't require full retirement, but it needed to see some genuine transfer of control. And the taxpayer's continued involvement and influence was problematic, as was his statement that nothing had changed. A fundamental flaw in his appeal strategy is that he didn't realise that the burden of proof fell on him. And as he had no supporting evidence, he never got out of the starting gate.
Well, that sounds like a good point to take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about the evidence requirement in tax cases and who has the burden of proof.
Running a business means making big decisions. And when it comes to taxes, those decisions can have a lasting impact. Whether you're navigating complex property transactions, planning a corporate restructuring, or optimizing shareholder remuneration, you need a strategy that works for you. At CoVenture Tax Consulting, we specialize in tax planning solutions tailored for businesses. Our team of experts helps you tackle the complexities of property deals, corporate reorganizations, and shareholder planning, all while ensuring you stay compliant and maximize your financial outcomes. From strategic tax advice for growing companies to planning shareholder distributions and optimizing remuneration structures, CoVenture Tax Consulting provides clear, actionable solutions designed to save you time, reduce risk, and protect your bottom line. Your business deserves more than a one-size-fits-all approach. Partner with CoVenture Tax Consulting and unlock tax strategies that align with your goals. Visit coventure.ie, your trusted partner in smarter business tax planning, to schedule a consultation.
Daphne, if it wasn't for all of the other flaws in the taxpayer's case, I'd be confused. Can you please explain why an offhand comment could prove to be so detrimental to a case?
Well, boxing fans know the Queensberry rules. Fair strikes only, neutral corners, fighting with gloves. Both sides have the same chance and must put in the same effort to win. Revenue laws require the taxpayer to satisfy the burden of proof.
And if the taxpayer can't meet the burden of proof,
They lose.
so the system assumes that revenue are right and the taxpayer is wrong, unless the taxpayer can positively demonstrate otherwise. Why is this considered fair?
Well, it comes down to information asymmetry. Traditionally, the view was that the taxpayer alone had access to the facts about their financial affairs, facts that revenue couldn't easily obtain. The position of the courts was that any material information would be within the grasp of the taxpayer.
Is that the same in all tax cases? Like, what about criminal cases?
In criminal tax cases, the burden of proof shifts to the state, and that's because revenue must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, there was a case where a conviction was quashed because revenue didn't disclose the basis for its assessments, but that was a criminal case. In civil cases, the burden of proof remains with the taxpayer.
Is it fair that taxpayers have to carry the burden of proof?
This is where the conversation gets interesting, isn't it? Because times have changed. Revenue has extensive tools to gather information, including mandatory disclosures, international data exchange agreements, and sophisticated e-auditing software that processes taxpayers' raw data. The argument that revenue is disadvantaged by a lack of information doesn't hold water anymore.
What advice do you have for companies who are reorganising but concerned about a revenue challenge? How do they avoid genuine tax planning coming across as murky and being labelled tax avoidance?
Businesses have the right to structure their affairs efficiently, but tax laws are very sophisticated and have been honed over decades. Business owners need to know their tax history because revenue have a lot of tools to challenge planning, which, although legal, is against the spirit of tax law. Tax law is as much about interpretation as it is about numbers. Laws can't anticipate every scheme, so they rely on interpretation to enforce their intent. And that creates grey areas, and it's these cases that attract revenue attention. That's where we come in. We design and implement tax planning so that businesses operate outside this grey area and therefore avoid unwanted attention from revenue.
For businesses who didn't have a tax expert in their corner and have failed at the Tax Appeals Commission, what are their options if they still think that the Commission got it wrong?
You used to have the Tax Appeals Commission, the Circuit Court, and then the High Court, but the Circuit Court was removed as an option in 2016.
What does it mean for people if their only resort after the Tax Appeals Commission is the High Court?
This has meant that the Tax Appeals Commission has become formal and more rigorous in following rules such as due process and the burden of proof.
Especially with the Circuit Court removed as a next level option, it sounds like the system is overly engineered in favour of the revenue commissioners and those with deep pockets. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, very much so. The Circuit Court was a critical check on appeal commissioners' decisions. Without it, taxpayers can only appeal on points of law to the High Court, a costly and inaccessible option for most.
So the system is unbalanced?
Not entirely.
You have some good news then?
Revenue has a duty to substantiate its assessments before the Tax Appeals Commission, and taxpayers have grounds to demand transparency and challenge Revenue's judgments.
OK, let's wrap this up. What's your final message on this?
It's fair to say that as a taxpayer, you have rights. But if you want to challenge an assessment, you have to do most of the heavy lifting.
Heavy lifting? We're back to boxing, aren't we? Well, I'm floored. And with that, we've concluded another episode of Irish Tax Unwrapped. We've taken quite the journey. From the fields of Mayo to the desert of Las Vegas and the legal chambers of the Tax Appeals Commission. If you want to go the distance in your business, roll with the punches and not throw in the towel when confronted by revenue, it's clear that having a tax expert in your corner will help you avoid that knockout punch. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to reach out. Until next time, keep your finances in check and your tax knowledge sharp.
If you enjoy Irish Tax Unwrapped, please rate, subscribe and share the podcast. If you've any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please contact the show on X @TaxUnwrapped or email the show podcast@taxiq.ie.